Benvenuti nello spazio MDI organizzato dall'Associazione Culturale Dotmob. Inauguriamo con questo speciale incontro la nascita del progetto MDI Mediateca d'impresa, che ha lo scopo di ampliare la conoscenza sul mondo dell'impresa e della professionalità. Oggi incontriamo Jessica Powell, ex vicepresidente di Google Communications, columnist del New York Times ed autrice del libro dal titolo italiano La Grande Distruzione, edito da Campanotto editore ed abilmente tradotto da Zara De Min. Un'occasione inoltre per presentarvi la storia di collaborazione vincente tra una realtà come la Casa Editrice friulana, diretta abilmente dal poeta, artista e imprenditore Carlo Marcello Conti, e l'intellettuale imprenditrice americana Jessica Powell. Una collaborazione fortemente voluta dall'editore per porre l'attenzione su un tema quanto mai attuale, il dominio dell'Internet Company. Questa è la nostra Mediateca d'impresa, un archivio digitale che raccoglie storie di impresa e di professionalità proprie di un territorio i cui valori non hanno confini. Buona visione!
Good morning, Jessica.
Good morning.
Good evening to all the other Italian people that will see this interview, because here in Italy it's 6:30 p.m. Today we are here with Jessica Powell. So Jessica Powell is a former vice president of communication of Google, and now she is a New York Times contributing opinion writer and the author of The Big Disruptions. That is the theme of today. So first of all, how are you, Jessica?
Great, thanks.
So thank you very much to be here with us and to share with us your the presentation of your book. And if you agree, we'll go straight on the questions of this. So first question: why writing?
I always loved writing, but I had no idea and no intention to write a book. I was just working at a pretty crazy startup in London called Badoo, which I think was popular in Italy as well.
Yeah.
And I was very immersed in the startup ecosystem there. And I just kept seeing so many things around me that just sort of shocked me. And I think they shocked me because when I got into technology, I very much bought into what I was told, and I think it was sincere that that we were trying to change the world for the better, that everyone who worked in technology was really interested in an open, democratic, egalitarian society, and that the things we were building were to improve people's lives. And I generally had a pretty good experience in my initial years at Google and thought a lot of that was very true, sometimes exaggerated, but on the whole, pretty true. But once I switched over into a startup that's had, I'd say, a different mission and a different way of working, and started to see kind of the broader picture of tech, and also started to look at my former employer differently too, right? I felt like every time I would raise issues around things that I thought were wrong, things we were doing to users or ways that we were approaching certain things, people would tell me not to worry about it or that it wasn't a problem. And so I started writing for myself. It was sort of a cathartic experience of saying, okay, well, if you all say that what I'm seeing and saying isn't wrong, how wrong do I have to make it for you to agree with me? And I think that's why I started to write satire. But I think the very funny part at the end of the day is that although the book is satire and it's not real, it's not 40 degrees off of reality. It's maybe 10% off of reality at best.
Yeah, I understand. Then that was the second question. So why this book? Why The Big Disruption?
Yeah, well, so like I said, it was never meant to be a book. It was I think a cathartic thing for me to do to try and make sense of the world that I was in. I really struggled with the fact that I was, in my early 30s when I wrote it, and that I was traveling business class and was making more money than other people in my family, and I didn't think I had done anything special to get to any of those places. and didn't think that we necessarily, as companies or people working in tech, deserved a lot of the power and influence that we had. And so I was just interested in exploring those themes. I think also I was, particularly as I realized it was becoming a book. Again, initially it was just me being mad and writing on the page. But I think as it began to take form into something else or something bigger, I think the other thing that interested me was that a lot of what I saw written about tech in 2012 when I wrote this, and even today, I would say, is that people talk about tech companies as if, there's this evil plot for world domination, or that everyone's just trying to get at your data, your personal data. And I think in a lot of ways, the reality is actually darker than that. It's more innocent and also darker. And what I mean by that is that, if the goal was really just to get your personal information, then there would actually be a pretty clear path for how governments and society could deal with that, right? There's a clear goal, and therefore you can look at different ways of hindering that, or making sure it happens in a responsible manner. But I actually think the driver of a lot of what happens in tech is more of this insatiable desire to expand. And I don't think there's always this master plan of how they run the world, but I think there's an inability for them to sometimes look and say, well, do we really need to go into that business? Do we really need to be doing this? They have so much access to capital, and there's such a cultural value in tech for constant innovation, and also like what we call FOMO, fear of missing out, and seeing other companies getting into spaces that you want to be in too. That there's just this insatiable expansion constantly. And I actually think that is more worrisome than, say, our current fixation on, privacy, for example. And I wanted to talk about that because I thought that a lot of people were really focused on privacy, which matters. But I thought that people were missing a little bit the bigger picture.
So, as I said, when I approach your book, first reading your book, of course, I have been through your biodata. And then when I start to open the book and start reading it, I was really surprised because it was totally unexpected. Honestly speaking, I was not expecting. I was expecting more like the I don't know, a critic or a satire that is we saw on previous movies that has touched this subject. But yours was really surprising me in a very nice way. I mean,
Oh, thank you. That's
no,
really
it's a reality because it's something that the story is very nice. The people, the characters are very very nice, and I really enjoy it. And so, in a certain point, Walter Mossberg wrote that you have done a brilliant satire of the male engineer-driven culture of Silicon Valley, where the leaders are cryptic and obtuse to reality. So that's very, very, very strong sentence. That's
yeah. I mean, I think there's a lot of truth in that. I think the truth of the book, if you will, again, everything is made up. Um, the characters are all fictional. Lots of people have tried to guess who the nymphomaniac CEO is, for example, and there is not a specific person. Also, there are so many CEOs like that out here that, take your pick. Um, but I think the truth of the book is really in that. It's in these sort of primitive desires to expand and the lack of checks on that growth. And tied to that, one of those important checks, which I don't really get into in the book, of course, is regulation and the government's role. But I also think it has to do with who works in these companies. The book is trying to get at a truth around what drives these companies' expansion and get at it in a funny way. But I think there is an underlying serious message in there. And I think what happens is that a lot of times, of course, regulation and the government's role in this kind of growth and expansion is important. My book doesn't really get too much into that. But I also think, and the book touches more on this, it also has to do with who works in technology and who runs these companies, who gets the capital to start companies, and who they hire. And when you look, whether you're looking at startups or large companies, for the most part, it's largely men, largely very few women, particularly on the engineering side, very little class diversity, very little educational diversity. We all tend to come from the same schools. I'm guilty of this too, right? I'm part of that as well. But we tend to come from the same schools, the same class background, upper middle class and above, that went to Stanford or Harvard or MIT, the top schools, or the top schools in other countries as well. And it creates an echo chamber where we tend to build for ourselves. We tend to convince ourselves that problems that don't affect us, or that are just small percentages of something that happens on our platforms. So something that happens to only 0.01% of users sounds very, very small. But if you're talking about billions of users, that's not small. And those use cases, those problems may actually be huge problems, right? And so we don't really, because we have a lack of diversity and a general sort of monoculture of thought, we don't really build for the world, and we don't also look for solutions. I think there's so many examples one can come up with. But if we just take women, for example, they can be innocent, like the first smartwatches that came out, right? No one ever thought about women's wrists, which are smaller, right? Or, one of my most striking examples to me, less innocent potentially, is that when Lyft launched, which Lyft and Uber, of course, the ride sharing platforms, it was encouraged that you, as the passenger, sit in the front seat with the driver, because they were your friend you were paying to give you a ride somewhere. But the idea, the marketing, was that this is your friend. And as a woman, getting into a car with a man I didn't know, it was almost always male drivers, and the vast majority were perfectly fine. But getting into a car with a man I don't know, sitting in the front seat, he controls the locks to the door. Like, that's a pretty scary experience. But there wasn't a woman sitting there that just on that team that decided that said, you know what, maybe some women and some men aren't going to be comfortable with that experience, right? Again, you can come up with millions of examples like this, and some of them matter tremendously, and some of them are more of just sort of embarrassing Silicon Valley failures. But you have that across the board, whether we're looking at class or race, age, and so forth. And I think that's what the book was trying to get at too, is that a lack of diversity in the Valley is actually what contributes to this ceaseless expansion and some of the mistakes that companies make when they're rolling out products and platforms.
Wow, that's very nice. Very nice to hear that. Very nice point of view. On the Silicon Valley, so is the emblem of the continual research and progress and technology. So it appears that not everything is good and nice.
There is still so much that's really good here. I think one thing that also bothered me about a lot of the books or articles that would come out about technology is that they were uniformly negative or painted people here as horrible people. And really, when I look at a lot of the problems that exist in the tech industry, sexism, racism, ageism, lack of diversity, that is absolutely true in other industries, absolutely. Right? I mean, I work in music now, and because of my book, I deal a lot with the publishing industry too. They're horrible too. It's more, I think that the issue with the tech industry is that we've always held ourselves up as being better than everyone else. And not only that, but we marketed ourselves to people, not as companies, but as service, almost as if we were nonprofits, services for you to make your life better, to improve. Right. And I think that means that we are and should be held to a higher bar. If you're going to benefit from getting to market your products like that and recruit people to your companies pretending you're or saying you are better, then you better be better. I do think the other thing that is really positive about tech, and somewhat unique, is I think there's a really strong culture here, which I really value, of asking really big questions and not assuming that because something has always been done one way, that it has to be done that way forever. And the enthusiasm which the community generally embraces that kind of process, and the ease with which you can start companies compared to other countries, for example, I think is really, really valuable. And having that, encouraging that kind of curiosity and invention is something that we want to preserve and encourage elsewhere too, right? I mean, it can't be throw out all of Silicon Valley in one go, because I think it's a very hard argument to make that Silicon Valley or technology generally has been, net negative and horrible. People say that, but I think that when you really look into that, that's a hard argument to make.
Yeah, I fully agree. So we cannot say that everything is negative, everything is bad, because from technology, if we think only on the research and the technology in the medical application, so now we can do
you and I are
things.
talking right now.
Sorry?
Right? I mean, you and I are talking.
We
met over email, and we are doing this on a video conference. And even my book, I wrote the book in 2012, and an agent took it to New York, where all the publishers, and in the US, that's where all the fancy publishers are. And all the publishers rejected it. They said, your author, I was anonymous, your author thinks, this book is funny, yes, and it's well written, but there's zero commercial market for this book. No one's interested in technology, and no one will buy this. I mean, they said it nicer than that, but it was essentially, there's no commercial market. And I remember sitting in Silicon Valley hearing that feedback and just saying, what are you talking, like I had no faith in the quality of the writing or its humor. I had no idea, but the commercial market, to me, that was very clear. I could already see how much the influence of technology already in our lives then, and that it was only growing. And the idea that that would not be of interest to people outside those directly working in the companies, to me, was very clearly wrong. And so everyone rejected the book. I gave up on the book, didn't even think about it, went back to work at Google, went to that startup, and went back to work at Google. And it sat on a digital dusty shelf for years. And it was only after I left Google, about 6 months or a year later, that a friend who had the manuscript sent it on to Medium, which is an online platform in the US. They bought it. They'd never published a book before, but they were like, why not? We like to experiment. And so they bought it, they published it, and it had huge readership. And so, like, if I owe the fact that my book was even published to a startup, right? I owe that to technology. I could never be against technology.
No, neither me, because traveling around the world, also I can see my family every night and talk with them and see them. So there's a big advantage too. So at the end, we said that not everything is negative, but today we are in front of the effect of the social media. Social media, especially for young people, is something that will bring them together, or it's something that will isolate them more than what that is the reality.
I mean, I have no idea what the future will look like. Clearly, there's already been a lot of research done around the negative impact of social media in terms of teens and isolation and so forth, time outdoors as well. This may be overly optimistic, but I would like to think that there will, in the same way, if I think about McDonald's, right? When I was a kid, we ate a lot more fast food than I think I would if I grew up in the same family today. Meaning same class, same location, all of that. But McDonald's was a I don't know, a once a week treat for us as kids after school because it was cheap and it was easy, and my mom would take us there. I don't think she would do that today, right? And in fact, if you look at McDonald's and the influence of fast food in America, and I think in other countries, you see it declining. You see them changing their menus, right? There was no salad on the McDonald's menu when I was a kid. No way. There was no smoothie, right? It was milkshakes and chicken McNuggets. Um, and so, I do think of what happens sometimes is you have new technologies, or say food, introduced, and the pendulum goes in one direction, and then there's a negative reaction against it, and we swing back, and then maybe we end up there again, right? But so I'd like to think I think there's much more awareness now among parents about the negative impact of social media, and in schools. Again, 5 years ago, schools weren't talking about banning phones, and now I think there's a lot of conversation around banning phones. So I don't know what the future will look like, and I do think that as our ability to live so much of our lives online only increases, we're going to have that tension. It's not going to disappear. But I could also imagine that we will form different norms or strategies as parents, as teachers, and even as consumers, that impact how we interact with that technology and to what degree it dominates our lives, or in what way it dominates our lives. So I think it's worrisome, but I also just think that whatever the problem is we think it is today, it'll be a different problem in 10 years. And we kind of have to think about not necessarily fighting the technology, but finding interesting ways to mediate it, I guess would be the right way to say it.
Yeah, agree. Okay, so those are the questions we had to ask, and thank you very much for this conversation. That has been very useful for me too. And I would like to invite everybody that will see this interview published to read the book, because it's extremely interesting and is an approach extremely different from what we have got about technology since today. So
Got a good title in Italian, right?
Sorry?
I said the title in Italian sounds very good too.
Yeah, it's a little bit different because La Grande Distruzione means it's more catastrophic, because in English, disruptions is discontinuity, is to change something. That in Italian, destruction means really bombing it to zero. So it's not the same, but nevertheless, the book is extremely interesting. So if you have the chance, please read this book. And thanks again to Jessica Powell for this time.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.